Let me introduce Peter. Thank you, Peter, for joining us so late. So Peter Mumby is a professor of coral reef ecology and at the University of Queensland. He has worked in Belize for 30 years and will share some perspectives on the ability of conservation to improve the outlook for coral reefs in the region. Thank you, Peter. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Marisol, and thank you, Melanie, for the invitation. And first of all, good morning, and apologies for the really dodgy green screen. And this computer is my old faithful field laptop. It has survived buckets of salt water, but it does not have a good camera anymore. So apologies for the poor quality of my video, but you don't need to see me, you need to see my slides. So I'll set that going. Okay. And I'll close that. Okay, I hope you can see all that. And again, thanks for the invitation to join your meeting this morning. I won't be staying very long because it's nearly 1 a.m. in Australia, but I'd like to talk a little bit about, let's turn off some of these functions. Talk a little bit about resilience on reefs, particularly focused on Belize, because that's where my experience is. And I first came to Belize in 1991, South Waikiki area, and I'm sure, like all of you, there are places that you first started working that you have a deep affection for. And I remember that there were parts of the reef at South Waikiki that I knew so well. I could find every coral species I needed to locate. And I was heartbroken 8 years later when I visited again after Hurricane Mitch to see what had happened there. But I've been studying those reefs with colleagues for nearly 30 years now, and we recently published sort of 20 years of that data, and I'm going to summarize a little bit of that for you. And so some of the sites we set up were within what was to become the South Waikiki Marine Reserve, and some of the sites on the Barrier Reef were outside that reserve, so we have a comparison there. And there's a number of sites at Glover's Reef which have been in a reserve ever since 1996. And so they act as a kind of control for what happens if there's no fishing. And so the parrotfish story, if we plot the mean biomass of parrotfish, this is data that I collected from 2002, at that point, there wasn't really much fishing of parrotfish. The biomass was reasonably high, probably not that different from what it is now. But then as you know, that fishing intensified, and by about 2004, fishing for parrotfish had become pretty dominant in Belize. And not surprisingly, by 2008, the parrotfish populations were much lower than they were only 6 to 8 years earlier. And then in 2009, the South Waikiki Marine Reserve came into effect, as did the national ban on parrotfish and other herbivorous fish exploitation. And over the 9 years since then, there's been a very strong recovery of parrotfish in the region, according to my data. And this is data taken at a depth of around 10 meters on Orbicella reefs, the complex reef habitat on the outer reef. And so we've seen this recovery of parrotfish, and in fact, parrotfish biomass by 2018 was higher than it was at the start of these surveys. And I'll talk a bit about that. Of course, I know that in the last few years, things may have changed a little bit, but this was the main trend that I've observed. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on biomass. Biomass is a really useful metric, but we found that sometimes converting the data into a little bit more detail can be helpful. So if you want to know more about what the parrotfish are doing, we need to think about what species of parrotfish there is and how big they are. And so this is data I've collected on the body length of fish and their bite rates. And I have this for different parts of the Caribbean. I also have it for the Mar region if people are interested. And then we also take into account how much reef surface area are those fish feeding on? Because they tend not to feed on live coral. And the more complex the reef, the more surface area there is. So we have a new metric, and we found previously, this is work from the Eastern Caribbean, that if you were to use biomass as a predictor of the density of juvenile corals on reef, you can explain about 8% of the variance. But if we use the same data set, but now we convert the parrotfish biomass into this metric of grazing intensity, so how much reef is grazed per hour per transect, we can explain 3 times more variance in these things. So it's a sort of cleaner way of looking at those relationships. But biomass is still useful. So if we look at what happened over time at Glover's Reef, we see that the grazing intensity has actually increased quite considerably between 1998 and 2018. And I think that, this increase of grazing intensity is mostly because there's less coral now than there was. That's mostly attributable to Hurricane Mitch and the delayed effects of that. And that provides more grazing area. At the same time, the habitat hasn't changed very much. The main difference is on the tops of those orbicellar corals, where if you look at annularis, any of those dead knobs have sort of been eroded away by parrotfish feeding, and the ones that are still alive have continued growing. And so it's sort of got rid of that very narrow microhabitat. And at the same time, we've seen far fewer urchins now hiding on the tops of these corals than we used to, because they don't have the habitat any longer. Okay, so if we look at what happened over time, then that the macroalgal cover, this is at Glover's, has gone down considerably over time. And the reason for that is because the grazing intensity has increased. So again, if we plot macroalgal cover against grazing intensity, where you have high grazing intensity, we've had a decline of macroalgal cover, which is what you would expect. And if we look at what happened on the barrier reef, a similar thing has occurred, that there's this negative relationship between macroalgae and grazing intensity. And again, this is at a depth of around 10 meters on the forereef. But of course, an interesting question is, what does that all mean for reef resilience? And one of the key things that a resilient reef will do is have periods of recovery after disturbance. It will still get disturbed, but hopefully it will still show recovery. And if we look at what happened, and I don't have as frequent a sampling as you do, but if we look at coral cover over time, what we see is a significant decline after Hurricane Mitch, and that took a while to keep happening. But then we see that coral cover has sort of stabilized, and in some cases it's gone up and then down a bit. But the important point is that it has been hit by disturbances several times, and yet coral cover's sort of remaining at this point at around between about 15 and 20%, 23%. And that tells us that at least there's capacity that the corals have been able to bounce back to some extent from those disturbances. Otherwise, coral cover would be very low and stable at a very low cover. So that's encouraging. And to me, what we see from this long-term view is consistent with what you would expect. So here's an example of, some of you may be familiar with this study that Bob Stennett led, where we wanted to simulate what is the consequence of fishing out the larger species of parrotfish. So anything about 25 centimeters or greater. And we obviously didn't go and remove parrotfish. Instead, we put these parrotfish deterrents on the reef. These are stainless steel spines that poke the parrotfish in the eye if they try to feed. And after a year, these parrotfish deterrents became completely covered in brown macroalgae. This is Dictyota. And what happened is, in the controls, there was much less algae, and that led to at least a halving of coral recruitment. And this is experimental evidence. This is quite compelling that these small-scale effects on algae can be triggered by reduction of bigger parrotfish, and that reduces coral recruitment. The other thing I was going to share with you is, we asked a few years ago, if there is this relationship between parrotfish and reef health, how much parrotfish can you harvest and still have a healthy reef? And of course, parrotfish are quite a resilient fishery species. They grow rapidly and they recruit very highly. So in theory, you could fish parrotfish quite extensively. Now, we spent a lot of time building models and testing them against data of parrotfish populations. And that allowed us to then simulate fishing them and how the reef would respond. Because we have other models that link the grazing to the dynamics of corals and algae. And all of these models have been tested against field data. And here's the main result. I just need to explain the graph. What we did here is we set a scenario in 2015. We said that coral cover will start at 15%, which was about average at the time. What would the coral cover be in the year 2030 if we had different levels of parrotfish harvest? So the x-axis is harvest rate. That's the proportion of parrotfish that are available to fish that are being removed every year. And the key point we see, and the two lines are for different fisheries policies, but that's less important. This is the key result. If you did not fish parrotfish at all, coral cover would be about stable over that 15-year period, despite bleaching, despite hurricanes. And it would be just about staying the same or maybe increasing a bit. But as soon as you start harvesting parrotfish, you see a rapid decline in the average coral cover. And what that tells us is that for these sorts of reefs, whilst you can fish parrotfish and not overexploit the stock, you will have effects on the reef at very low levels of fishing. And so I think that the decision in Belize to ban parrotfish harvest was justified with these sorts of results. And I'd like to finish off by just talking a little bit about the evidence for management. You'll undoubtedly all have read or heard about scientific studies that claim that there's no effect of MPAs or fishing bans on reefs, and that the relationship between parrotfish and corals doesn't really exist. And, some studies legitimately do find that there is little benefit of conservation. I mean, we don't expect it to happen the same everywhere. And for example, in shallow, quite nutrient-rich patch reefs at Glover's, there's very little effect of fishing on the health of the reef there these days. Similarly, areas of reef that are dominated by gorgonians don't tend to have much of an effect of parrotfish. But for proper reefs that have high levels of structure, we would expect to see something. And what we've done over the last year or two is use our models of the ecosystem to simulate what would be realistic responses of reefs to protection from fishing. And we compare that to reality. And then we say, if we now simulate a scenario where we have a reserve effect, and then ask, so this is the actual change in coral that happens over time. And then we say, well, how do people go about actually measuring this in the field very often? And there's lots of different ways people do that. But we simulate field sampling, the coral cover, the transects, the quadrats, the fish surveys. And then we run a statistical analysis and we say, did the statistical analysis actually pick up the trend that was really there? And what we find when we do that is that the vast majority of scientific studies that have looked for an effect of management on coral do not have the design and the power to detect those effects. Let me give you an example. Some of those study designs would have people going out and surveying a reef once and then coming back 10 years later and surveying it again. There's a number of papers out there that have done that and have found no detectable effect of reserves on the reef. And the thing is, there's lots of reasons why they wouldn't detect it, even if it was there. And as an example, we have scenarios where there might actually be a 20% increase in coral cover. So from 5% coral cover to 25% coral cover that a lot of study designs would not be able to detect. So that means we have to be pretty cautious when interpreting results that can claim there's no effect. And if you're interested in any of these papers, just let me know. I'm happy to send them to you. This one was only recently published, and it talks about this problem and what can be done about it. So to summarize, I think it's fair to say that reefs of the Mesoamerican region can't handle much fishing of parrotfish. I think it's fair to say that the Belize parrotfish ban is working. Now, I understand that things may have wobbled in the last couple of years with COVID and extra pressures on people. But I think we know that the ban can work. Parrotfish have increased even in places where there wasn't even any fishing problems. And I think this is reflecting the increase in food availability and possibly things like the increase in acropora habitat for recruitment. So that's a good thing because it helps maintain sufficient grazing on those reefs. And although we're going to see trends of coral cover dipping and parrotfish declining and algae might even increase, because we've seen really severe changes around the years sort of 2005 to 2008, we know this is reversible. And there is often a lot of concern that when reefs get really degraded, they can stay that way. What I think we're seeing in the Mesoamerican region is that there is the ability for those things to reverse if the management can be brought back into place. I think we need to treat scientific studies reporting negative results with a lot of skepticism. And there's a particular study led by John Bruno that argues that there isn't much effect. I would just suggest you treat that with some caution. This is obviously a very difficult, it is difficult to try to relate MPAs or bans to increased resilience. But one of the problems that a lot of these scientific studies have is not a good design. And I think that the Healthy Reef Initiative is actually doing the right thing, and that you have frequent monitoring of all of the key processes. And that's exactly what is the right way to do this. So, that's really terrific. And a lot of science papers don't have that kind of sampling. I mean, even the papers I'm just showing you don't have annual surveying in. So, clearly it's a difficult time in the region. You are aware of that more than I am. But I do think there is capacity for recovery and that things can reverse if the management can be reinforced. And I'd just like to share with you that, as a person who really loves this region, who doesn't live there anymore, thank you very much for your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. That was great.